SMSF property investments have been a hot topic lately, and it's clear that this interest isn't fading anytime soon. However, investing in property through an SMSF comes with its own set of compliance challenges, rules, and regulations. Today, I'm delighted to speak with Kris Kitto, the founder and director of Grow SMSF, to dive deeper into the world of SMSF property investments. Hi, Kris. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Todd. Great to be here.
Kris, there's still some confusion out there regarding a fundamental aspect of property investment. Firstly, could you clarify for us what types of property trustees can invest in and what types are off limits?
Sure. In general, SMSF trustees can invest in a wide range of properties. So residential, commercial, and pretty much everything in between. So this could include things like houses, apartments, shops, offices, factories, rural property, farmland, short-term accommodation, and even some of the more specialized properties such as disability accommodation, NVIS type of properties, and even overseas properties. So there is a wide range of property types which are available to SMSF trustees. But as you mentioned, there are some very important restrictions in there as well. Probably the main one, which is often asked and misunderstood, is that an SMSF cannot purchase a residential property that you already own personally. So you can't sell a personally owned residential investment property into your SMSF. Secondly, if you do have a residential property inside your SMSF, you can't lease that back to yourself or any family member or any related party. And that includes holiday properties as well. So you can't buy a nice little weekender somewhere in your SMSF and then go and stay in it. So those are the main restrictions that trustees need to be aware of. However, the flip side of that is when it comes to commercial property, what we call business real property that's used exclusively in a business, that can actually be leased back to a related party business, has to be at market value lease in place, but there are some very strict rules around that as well. But that is one option where I guess business owners can actually use their SMSF to purchase commercial premises to operate their business from. So, there is still quite a lot of scope for SMSF trustees when it comes to their property investment options.
Based on some of the challenges and issues you've encountered in regards to SMSF property investments, what are some of the absolute do's and don'ts that trustees should keep in mind before entering this asset class?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess with an SMSF, the success or failure of the SMSF really at its core comes down to asset selection. And that doesn't matter whether it's property, shares, managed funds, or any other type of investment an SMSF chooses to make. It really comes down to what you buy. That's going to determine your success or failure. So I guess the biggest mistake that I see trustees make, or especially inexperienced SMSF trustees, and everyone's got to start somewhere, and it can be quite a brutal learning curve sometimes, is they rush in to buy a property without actually stepping back and really considering their overall strategy. So what are they actually looking to achieve? Are they looking for something that provides really good yield or income? Are they looking for capital growth? What's their investment time frame? And importantly, what's their exit strategy? So unfortunately, I do see too many trustees. They'll go and have a chat to their mortgage broker. They'll figure out how much they can borrow underneath an SMSF, and then within sometimes days they'll be signing contracts to buy basically the first property they come across that they can afford. And as I said, that may work out, but once again, I do feel people do rush into it a little bit too quickly. And what's even potentially worse is sometimes people get, and this is not just in an SMSF, this is in general, this happens across the investment space as well. Sometimes people get sold into an investment which may not necessarily be in their best interest. So I think the main thing is people just need to slow down and also seek advice. So first of all, step back and figure out, is the strategy of using your super to buy a property suitable for you. So you'd have to go and speak to a licensed financial advisor to get some advice on whether that actually aligns to, what you're trying to achieve. And then if it is something that is suitable for you, make sure that you do your own, due diligence, your own research when it comes to that property selection, and also consider working with a buyer's agent or advocate, someone who you pay and they work for you. So they've got no conflicts of interest in regards to recommending a particular property. So doing those things, like seeking that professional advice and guidance, you're more likely to have a positive outcome long term. And that's the thing with the nature of the asset. You're not actually going to know whether you've been successful or not for many, many years. So because property is very much a long-term asset in most cases, you're not holding it and buying and selling in the short term. You're holding it for the long term. Therefore, you really do need to take your time and make sure you get that initial purchase decision right.
Yeah, and another area that seems to cause confusion amongst people who want to invest in property is borrowing. Actually, people seem to have a few issues with understanding what they can and can't do, how much they could borrow, for example. So, in your experience, what are some of the common misunderstandings in this area?
Yeah, that's interesting. So the main confusion from what I see, it comes down to the actual structure. And once I explain it, you kind of understand why, because it is confusing. So in general, SMSFs are not allowed to borrow money. The exception is with what's called limited recourse borrowing arrangements or bare trust arrangements that allows an SMSF to borrow. But the structure is tricky because it's not the SMSF itself, which is legally buying the property. The title of the property that the SMSF is buying is going to be held by a separate trustee company that holds it on behalf of the SMSF. So that by itself is incredibly confusing because you've got the SMSF, which is actually borrowing money from a lender. The SMSF is getting all the rent, it's entitled to all the capital gains, it's paying all the expenses, but the actual legal owner is a completely separate company that's adjacent and sits on the side. So that's, I guess, the crux of where things go wrong when people try to enter into these transactions. And that comes out in two ways. So the first major mistake that I see is that the buyer name or the purchaser name on contracts is incorrect. So they put the SMSF trustee, for example, when they should put the peer trustee. The second one comes to the timing. So when you sign the purchase contract, do you sign the purchase contract first and then the bare trust, or do you sign the bare trust documents and then the purchase contract? So once again, very confusing. And to make it even worse is that each state and territory actually has a different approach. So once again, it sort of comes back to that approach of making sure you're getting the right advice throughout that process. And if you do things correctly in the first place, it's going to make it a whole lot smoother, less stressful, and make that whole, process when you're borrowing to buy a property a lot easier. So that's sort of, I guess, one core thing with the purchase transaction. But I guess specifically with the borrowings itself, one sort of overlooked factor, and this quite often catches experienced property investors, is that as the SMSF pays down that loan, that mortgage on the property, it can't actually tap into or access the equity that builds up. So whereas if you're investing outside of super in your personal name or via family trust, etc., as that equity builds up, you can use that. You can use that equity to borrow against to fund other investments, other properties, etc. You can't do that in a self-managed super fund. So you cannot redraw that equity at all. So that's one other very, I guess, common challenge that people come up against. They see the equity that builds up, and then the only way to really tap into it is to actually sell the property, crystallize the capital gain, and then use the proceeds to reinvest.
Okay, and if the trustee has bought or invested in a property and they wanted to repair or renovate that property in their SMSF, what can they do that, first of all? And if they can, what steps should they take to ensure they are doing it correctly?
Yes, to be very clear, a property that's owned by an SMSF, whether there's borrowings there or not, can definitely be renovated. So there is a relatively common belief that where you have a property owned by an SMSF and there's borrowings involved, that you can't renovate that property, that you can only repair it. That's completely untrue, completely false. And I just want to be very clear. You can renovate a property owned by an SMSF even when there's borrowings in there. So let's just lock that in. So what the confusion probably comes from the fact that you can't use borrowed money to make those renovations. Okay. So the SMSF must use its own cash resources. So the cash reserves it already has to make those improvements. Now, there's also a lot of improvements that can be done. So you can do large scale renovations. You can put in new kitchens. You can build granny flats. You can put a whole new roof on. You can extend, put another story on top if you've got enough funds to do it. So there's a lot you can do. The only caveat or the things that you can't do is you can't renovate the property so much that you change the nature and it becomes a completely different property. So you can't, say, knock down an old house and build, 3 or 4 units or duplexes or triplexes or something like that. And you can't convert a residential property into a commercial property and vice versa, because that would be creating something which is a completely different asset to what you had originally. And that restriction, it comes back to something called the single acquirable asset rule. So, that said, there's still so much that SMSF trustees can do when it comes to renovations. One maybe little, thing to be aware of is that there are restrictions around doing renovations yourself. Okay. So you can't basically, as a trustee, do work for free, but there's a bit of a catch-22 where you can't actually also get paid for your work. There are some very technical sort of limited exceptions, but if you are, for example, a tradesperson and you've got the capability to do the work on your own property owned by your SMSF, be very careful, seek advice. There's ways to do it correctly, and there's ways that will create massive compliance issues that you should avoid. So once again, seek advice before you pick up the tools.
As I mentioned earlier, Kris is the founder and director of Grow SMSF, a specialist SMSF accounting firm based on the Gold Coast. If you'd like to get in touch with him, you can find his contact details displayed on the screen now. Kris, thanks once again for joining me today, and I look forward to speaking with you again very soon.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks for having me.